The ever-growing industry of privatized prisons, generally referred to as the prison industrial complex, and the skyrocketing rate of incarceration has left the United States with the highest incarceration rate in the world. The issue ties together many social aspects, such as the connection between the massive rate of imprisonment for nonviolent drug use, rampant poverty, and the growing political influence of private prison industries that thrive on inmate population as cheap forms of labor. So what's an incarcerated criminal worth? What companies run these prisons? And how and what impact does the growing industry of private prisons have on communities that are now relying on these prisons as their only economic basis? Lots to talk about. The answers to those questions and more on today's Inside Out. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Susan Madaris. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. The Prison Policy Initiative, also called PPI, is a group created to reverse this trend and has been recording this extreme growth of the prison population and gathering data on the prison system for the last decade. Since 1991, the prison population has risen 50%. 75% of the inmates are there for nonviolent crimes like possession of illegal drugs. The PPI and others argue that this is directly correlated to the privatization of American prisons. Known as the prison industrial complex, these private prisons, unlike public ones, have the end goal of making a profit. Today, this has resulted in entire communities dependent upon local prisons for economic subsistence that in turn perpetrate and exploit social inequalities. I recently sat down with Anthony Thompson. He is a professor at NYU and the author of the book Releasing Prisoners, Redeeming Communities, Reentry, Race, and Politics. Here's what he had to say.
When you talk about prisons being privatized, private prisons occur in a couple of different ways. In 2011, we saw, for example, the state of Ohio sell a prison to Correctional Corporation of America, CCA, which is one of the two big private prison providers. That's a bit unusual. Privatization really has private prison authorities building facilities in communities, usually rural communities, or agreeing in their existing facilities to take out-of-state prisoners. And so I think you focus on the number of both civil and criminal detainees. So, for example, we see the number of immigration detainees increasing in private prisons. There's about 16,000 this year. And depending on whose study you believe, there's about anywhere from 170 to 200,000 individuals serving time in private prison.
The history of private prisons started with what was called convict leasing.
Historically, private prisons were part of something called convict leasing. At the end of slavery in the United States, you had these huge plantations that still needed workers, but slavery was outlawed. And so what would happen is facilities in the South in particular would engage in convict leasing. They would lease large numbers of convicts to plantation owners, to factory owners, and that forced labor essentially was the beginning of privatization of the corrections process. Then you saw a bit of a hiatus, and then in the huge jump in incarceration between the 70s and the year 2000, we saw an increase in privatization of prisons. You saw the development of the CCA, the Correctional Corporation of America, and GEO, which is at one point the Wackenhut Group. Those are the two primary private prison providers in the United States. There are others, but those are the kind of the big numbers.
With so much money being spent on prisons each year, what can be done to reduce the costs of this industry?
we are essentially kicking the can down the road in terms of policy decisions on sentencing reform, on other things. So I think that limiting the number of inmates that a particular jurisdiction can send, or limiting the number of facilities that can be built by private prisons, might be a start. But I think we need to rethink corrections more globally than simply the private prisons piece.
While the privatization of the prison system has proved to be big business, so has an industry less talked about, which is the prisoner reentry industry, or the PRI. According to my next guest, it has become a major part of the social control industrial complex. As with the prison industrial complex, the PRI is not just a collection of institutions, organizations, and interest groups, both public and private. It is also a state of mind. Professor Douglas Tompkins teaches at the Sociology Department at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He has done extensive research into the culture of violence within the prison community and the relationship between institutional social control policies and prisoner reentry. According to Professor Tompkins, developing and facilitating programs and services for the formerly incarcerated have become a huge cash cow, producing profits for the PRI at the expense of the taxpayer, while doing little to link the formerly incarcerated person to the social capital and human skills necessary to become a citizen.
Reentry for me is a period of post-prison supervision. You're still under the direction of the criminal justice system. I think that most people, when they think reentry, they're thinking reintegration. A person leaving prison, rejoining their community, their family, having a job, becoming a law-abiding citizen within the community, a contributing member of the community. Reentry for me, again, is post-prison supervision. And if you look at the data, the suggestion is that most people are going back to prison for violating conditions of release. 2 to 1, sometimes 3 to 1, going back to prison for violating conditions of release versus getting a new conviction. The industry consists of for-profit, non-profit, for-profit entities who provide services for persons coming out of prison. The industry now relies upon the formerly incarcerated person, and to be honest, members of their family, is the cash cow, the raw material that runs the engine of the industry. You have to have a client to service, to exist. If we were to look, you would find a huge increase in the number of entities, organizations that are now providing services for formerly incarcerated people.
Tompkins drew much of his research on the reentry industry from the prison industrial complex.
When you talk about private prisons, it is private, it is for profit. Profit is the main goal. If you go into those facilities, you'll find that you have undertrained, understaffed prison staff. You find that the services afforded prisoners are not the same because, again, it's for profit. Okay, you'll find that you have levels of conflict within these facilities. It's for profit. And I question if being for profit, if they're in the position to really provide the services that we as taxpayers expect from correctional agencies.
Tompkins notes that one of the important end goals of these programs should be to create employment opportunities for the formerly incarcerated and empower them to access the necessary resources afforded to all citizens. However, that's not the case.
For example, in the state of New York, in 2009, 65% of those persons on parole were unemployed. 65%. Less than 15% were employed full-time, making more than minimum wage. Now, that concerns me. It concerns me because we have, again, a list of organizations that suggest that they're in the business of positioning persons coming out of prison to be in a position to get a job, right? But when we look at the data, 65% unemployed in New York State, I question if these organizations, reentry type organizations, are actually doing their job.
So what kind of oversight is there in these organizations?
There really isn't any oversight. Many of the people that I've interviewed, most persons coming out of prison are required to do drug treatment and anger management, regardless of the conditions of their conviction, meaning no violence, no drugs. But you're still required to do those types of training. Much of that training treatment is being provided by private entities. Now, here's an example of the overall problem. An individual, many of the individuals I've interviewed would say, I had the opportunity to get a job, but the work schedule conflicted with my treatment schedule. So I went to my parole officer and asked if I could have my treatment schedule reworked so that I could do treatment and work. The parole officer's normal response is you have to work that out with your treatment coordinator. You go to the treatment organization, and those organizations will say to you, no, don't think so. You need to be here. This is the condition of your release, and if you don't show up, you know you may be violated. These are for-profit entities. These are organizations who are making a profit providing the services.
According to the Pew Research Center, of the 2.6 million Americans who are incarcerated, 1 million, or 43%, are African American men. African American men are 7 to 8 times more likely to go to prison than their white counterparts. Nearly 1 in 3 African American men will be incarcerated during their lifetime.
When you talk about racial discrimination, that includes the starting point, not being in a position to hire an attorney, not being in a position to make bond. Individuals who are in a position to make bond, to be released from jail pending their trial, are often in a better position to maybe beat their case, win a fair trial, so to speak, to maintain their family relationship, their work relationship. Race, is it about race? Of course it's about race. This is the United States of America. Okay, of course race plays a role, but it's also about class.
So to what extent do these private prisons work toward a profit? Prison Policy Initiative shows that these prisons exploit prisoners who work well below minimum wage. Not only that these prisons often feed local economies. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, this incentive for prison growth lends itself for lobbying to change laws to get more prisoners that targets minority groups and keeps building up prison populations.
So a number of rural communities, as the downturn occurred in 2008, began to gravitate toward private prisons as a way to generate income. The promise was build a prison, we'll bring inmates from out of the area, and we'll fill your facilities. And some of those were successful. Arizona's had some success with that in Texas. There were a number of communities, though, when you look at a place like Littlefield, Texas, or Hardin, Montana, that created a bond to build a facility. You know, Littlefield, Texas, I think spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $9 million and had a bond. After a year, that private prison went out of business. They were stuck with the bond. In Montana, Hardin, Montana, the town defaulted on the bonds because they never actually were able to fill the prison. So a lot of these rural communities were left kind of in the lurch economically. But there have been some successes. And in those communities, the danger is when you have a guaranteed number of beds by the private prison, right? And so you have some jurisdictions where either the private prison, as crime rates fell, people weren't going to be sent to that prison, and the threat of lawsuits, for example, you know, in Arizona, CCA threatened to sue one community for not sending enough prisoners, even though there were problems with escapes in Arizona. So I think that there are those kinds of economic impacts.
However, there are political implications as well.
Private prisons spend an enormous amount of money lobbying state government and federal government officials. And it's one of the intersections of our democratic process that's uncomfortable because we have a very public function, corrections, and yet we see the impact of lobbying dollars on corrections decisions and the ability to create private prison beds and private prison facilities. Even the federal government is doing a fair amount of business with private prisons around immigration detention now, and that looks to be the growth market for private prisons.
Founded in 1844, the Correctional Association is an independent nonprofit organization that advocates for a more humane and effective criminal justice system. Sophia Elijah is executive director of the Correctional Association of New York. The CA works to build communities most negatively affected by criminal justice policy. It is the only private organization in New York with unrestricted access to prisons. While New York State does not have any private prisons, the CA has found that prisons often ignore people's medical and mental health problems and leave their substance abuse problems untreated during the time of incarceration. And then there is the issue of inhumane treatment in the facilities.
So, throughout the country, medical care, health care for people who are incarcerated is abysmal, with few exceptions. And New York is no different. And part of this is because of the economy. And so there's not enough dollars that are being spent to provide people with adequate medical care. Dental care is absolutely abysmal. People who have substance abuse treatment issues are being treated kind of in a cookie cutter approach, so that it's a one size fits all, no matter how old or long someone has had an addiction problem. And so we have found that this is an ongoing problem. In addition, we found major problems with respect to the treatment of the mentally ill. There's a disproportionate number of people who have mental illness who are incarcerated. In large measure, this is because several decades ago we closed a number of mental health facilities, and therefore that population, not getting the kind of treatment that it needed in the community, found itself intersecting with the criminal justice system more often than not. And so the type of care available and treatment available for those who are mentally ill is lacking throughout the system, despite the best efforts of Department of Corrections and Community Supervision and the Office of Mental Health.
Aside from the issue of medical care, abuse and the inhumane treatment of the prisoners have also become a cause for concern.
We are constantly reminded through letters and through our visits of just brutality, physical brutality, emotional brutality, verbal harassment and brutality. That is rampant throughout the system. There's also a problem of sexual assault in the New York State system that has come to the attention of the federal authorities, and we've been working on that. We're also concerned about opportunities for educational and vocational training so that people have the ability to be contributing members of society when they return home. And then certainly there's the whole stigma of having a conviction. Then that gets in the way of being able to get a job, to get financial aid, to get housing, thereby making it more difficult for someone to successfully reintegrate into society.
In the last decade, New York has downsized the number of public prisons, and crime rates have dropped significantly. However, on the national front, the private prison industry has been on the rise.
Privatization of prisons is a major problem throughout the country. So the majority of the increase in prison building over the past decade or so has been with private prisons and not federal and state-run prisons. And the profit margin is what drives private prisons, and the cost-cutting measures to increase profits all come on the backs of those who are employed in the facilities and those who are incarcerated in the facilities.
The Correctional Association notes on its website that prisoner reentry should begin the moment someone enters a prison.
When someone first is incarcerated, there should be a major effort to involve their family members and their loved ones in their reentry process, so that when someone comes home, they're not strangers to their families or to their communities, and the strengthening of family ties and community ties has occurred during that period of time that they're incarcerated. So when they come home, the people that they're going to depend on for support have a better understanding of what that experience has been and how they can be the most supportive foundation for the person coming home. It also provides the formerly incarcerated person with a feeling of acceptance as opposed to a feeling of rejection, which is the system that we have now. Unfortunately, most of our reentry programs that involve the family start about 6 months before someone is going to come home, and that's just not enough.
While the families often try to make the efforts to stay in contact with the members that have been incarcerated, that itself has its challenges, notably for low-income families.
Most of the facilities are located in remote areas of New York State. The majority of the population that's incarcerated comes from New York City, and the majority of the facilities are in upstate New York. So just the cost of the travel to those places is very, very challenging. The prison system has a disproportionate impact on people of color and poorer people, and so the challenge of being able to maintain ties and to be able to visit is increased because of the economics of trying to travel to these remote places.
Logistics play hand in hand with collateral consequences once the person incarcerated returns home.
If someone has a felony conviction, they cannot have public housing. If they come back home to a family that is living in public housing, that family will lose their housing if that formerly incarcerated person returns home. So you're displacing families, or you're rendering the person who's coming home homeless because they can't go back to that public housing. There's many jobs that a person cannot qualify for if they have a felony conviction, thereby compromising their ability to contribute to the family support. So, and then there's the problem of Pell Grants. People who are incarcerated cannot receive Pell Grants towards their education. And it's most unfortunate because it's been shown that education is one of the key factors to successfully reentering into society. So if you can't get an education because you can't afford it, the likelihood that you're going to successfully reenter is greatly reduced.
We took to the streets to see what some people had to say about our topic of discussion today.
For me, it was hard because I came out from prison and I had nowhere to come out to. So, that's a different type of way of coming out homeless. But, if you put effort into doing the things that you feel you need to do for yourself, eventually I went to a halfway house. I didn't go to a shelter. I refused to go to a shelter. I got help and went to a halfway house.
Any way you can tackle the problem in terms of decriminalizing certain things, certain actions or offenses, it could be helpful. And I think that's not a bad way to go. And it's a good start. It's such a large problem that even if you're able to take on one issue and just use that and just really focus on that.
I think a large part of it is also the relationship between poverty, the economics of poverty, and crime.
That's all the time we have for today's show. Thank you for staying with us and watching. Remember, you can always send me your emails to insideout@SusanMadaris.com. I'm always looking forward to them. You can also follow me on Twitter for latest updates and discussions. Until next week in another show, goodbye.